Good morning and welcome to the NABERS CBD Conference 2020. I also want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands that we gather today from all across Australia and even beyond, and also echo the beautiful words by Yvonne just a few moments ago. I'm actually really excited about the conference today because we've put a lot of time and effort to design something in for everyone. We're going to have a lot of announcements about NABERS later on today, and we're going to be having a peek into the future of building sustainability into the next decade. And of course, we're going to be talking a lot about energy and water and waste and net zero emissions and sustainability at large. And what a lot of these challenges have in common is that they're really about the amount of pressure that we as human beings put on the natural environment. And real action in sustainability really is about not just window dressing or greenwashing, it's about taking meaningful action and reducing that pressure on the environment. And that's very much the values in which NABERS were built 22 years ago. We work with people to measure the real environmental footprint and take action to improve. And once you've done that, measure again and keep improving and getting into an ongoing cycle of improvement over time. And if you're someone like me who actually grew up overseas and came later in life to Australia, you will see that performance approach to sustainability is very much a defining feature of sustainability in Australia. It's a very unique, very Australian thing that I think all of us should feel really proud, and we're certainly proud as a program for the role that we played in that. Now, looking into the next decade, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that we have a tremendous challenge in the next decade, and we need to drive more change in all these aspects at a speed that we've never done before. It's the kind of challenge that requires all of us as individuals to make change and as organizations, but also the kind of change that cannot be done by any one organization, not NABERS, not CBD, not any one of the organizations you work for. It's the kind of change that can only be done in a collective sense. In other words, it's the kind of change that requires collaboration, building on each other's strengths to do more together and faster. And on that note, I think we've been very fortunate in NABERS that we've had plenty of partners to work with over the past 20 years. And I'm really excited that I'm sharing a room here with 4 absolute stars of the building sustainability space who've done so much for our sector. And each one of them is really the embodiment of collaboration. And much of what they've done and are doing now is actually by joining forces with others to do more in a collective sense. I'm really excited about where they think we need to be by 2030 and all the things we need to do along the way to actually get there. Now, before we go there, I want to start the day by reminding us all that everyone in this conference, the 1,000 people dialing in today, want the same thing. We want buildings to improve as fast as we can, as soon as we can. And we also want the building sector to lead the way in Australia for other sectors, because as we all know, buildings can get to net zero emissions sooner than other sectors. And so buildings moving faster can really help other sectors that either need more investment or is more expensive or need more technology to actually follow suit. And we all want that. I'm actually in that challenge, and as big as the challenge is in the next 10 years, I'm actually really optimistic, because as we're going to see later on today, I think in the last 10 years we've demonstrated, and you have demonstrated, that you have the talent, the expertise, and the creativity we need to drive an enormous amount of change in the short amount of time that we need. And our challenge in the next 10 years is really to scale that up from a portion of the built environment to really across the entire Australian economy. I hope you feel really energized about the day coming ahead, and I'm looking forward to an amazing panel with my colleagues here in the room and several other rooms. Back to you, Craig.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Indeed, the idea of collaboration is fantastic, and I think it's so true, because if I look at the people that are here today, and in so many other sectors, they'd all be fighting and hating each other. So it is quite extraordinary the way you've all managed to work together in this area. And on that note, I'd like to introduce our panellists for the next session, Why It Takes a Village to Raise a Sustainability Nation. Our panel today includes Alicia Maynard, Chairperson of the Better Buildings Partnership, Davina Rooney, CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia, Frankie Muskovic, the National Policy Manager, Sustainability and Regulatory Affairs, the Property Council of Australia, Carlos Flores, of course, the Director of NABERS, and Sabine Schaffer, the Managing Partner of ProInvest. When our panellists get settled in, a reminder for all of our attendees, you can enter your questions for any of our panellists today using the chat function. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of this, so make sure you get your questions in there. But on to our first question for the day, and this is for everyone. I'm going to go to everyone on this, and you've got about 2 minutes to answer this question, despite the fact that it is quite a big question. And that is, firstly, and this is in the policy area, this is my favourite part, What do you think have been the most impactful policies in the last decade, and what do you think are the most necessary policies for the coming decade? I'll go to you first, Frankie.
Thanks, Craig. A bit like you, policy's my bag in this space, and it's a passion that I have, along with everyone else on this panel, I think. When I think about the things that have been probably the most impactful over the last decade, I actually think about the Commercial Building Disclosure Program. I think it's a program that has driven an incredible step change in the performance of office buildings across the country. If I think then about what's needed into the future, is that we need foundational policies, so that the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure, is true across the board in the built environment. So I get so frustrated every time I speak on a panel like this and I have to say, well, leaders in our sector have reduced their emissions intensity by 52% in the last decade. And when I look at energy productivity across the whole economy, it's about 1%. So we are failing, we are succeeding at the very top of the market, but guess what? The built environment is a lot broader and more diverse than that. And so you've got a range of actors, and so it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution in terms of policies. We need minimum standards to approximate something other than the bare minimum of best practice, because for a certain chunk of the population, they just don't really care about this stuff, and they never will. So there's a bottom bit that needs to be brought up. We need the kind of benchmarking tools like NABERS to be available for every building type across the economy. And then I particularly want to comment on housing and established housing. I think NABERS is done an amazing thing in the commercial building types it covers right now. But if we look at the emissions from the built environment, half of them are in housing. So increasingly apartments, but we have a lot of established residential housing, and we have no way of benchmarking the performance of housing at the moment. So we need something that is simple, that is communicative to consumers, and encourages them, one, to first understand how they're using energy. It is ridiculous that in 2020 you can go into a department store and look at a washing machine that has a star rating on it that tells you, how energy efficient it is. But you can make the biggest investment of your life in a house, and you don't know how that's going to perform. You don't know how much it's going to cost you to run. So it's in all of our interests in terms of driving productivity across the economy, and we need that in the context of COVID as well, to make real progress in that space. So a few different thoughts there. You can tell I'm fired up. It's something I really care about.
It's great. It's great. I totally agree with you. I've been trying to assess the footprint of houses over the last couple of years. I can't get Carlos to come over to my house and benchmark my place. He's too busy. It's a disgrace. We'll come to you now, Carlos. What do you think have been the most important policies of the past 10 years, and going forward, what do we need to do?
I think for me, it's really hard to overlook the impact the CBD has had. And just to put this into context, there was a report from ASPEC a couple of years ago with ClimateWorks it's called Low Carbon High Performance. And one of the key pieces of work they did was to say, well, how fast the building sector had moved in the decade leading to 2017 as a whole. And it was a very slow improvement. It was about 2% in that decade. And then let's just contrast with what happened in the office market with disclosure. We saw an improvement of about a little bit more than 30% of reduction in energy consumption across the entire sector. So 52% across the leaders, like Frankie was mentioning, but also the tail end of the market moving at an incredible speed. We've never seen something like that in any sector in Australia. And I think it's fair to say that most countries around the world have never seen that. It's hard not to see CBD as probably the single most effective energy efficiency measure ever done for buildings, existing buildings certainly. And it's really hard to see that CBD not playing a bigger role across the built environment. Office is just one sector out of an enormous non-residential sector. And I think there's a lot of scope for that policy to having a more of an impact in going forward in the right sectors. The one last thing that I would mention is maybe the 2019 building code upgrade. It was a huge step forward in energy efficiency in commercial buildings. It didn't increase stringency in residential, and I think a lot of people want to see that happening in 2022. And in spite of the fact that a lot of people thought that 2019 could have gone further, I think what it demonstrated to me is that we can drive a lot of changes in the building code, and that is a really important lever. And when we put the time and effort, we can get significant step changes. And we need to look at that, because it's the CBD is the lever for existing buildings, but the building code is really the biggest lever for new buildings, and we need to do more and use it as much as we can.
So true. Thank you, Carlos. I'll go to Davina next. Of course, Davina from the Green Building Council has been around for a long time, early 2000s. And what do you think are the most important policy movers to the past and future?
Well, you can tell that it's policy boffin central. So I'll reference, I absolutely agree with our other panellists. I'd actually say an early piece of Australian leadership was going out with the energy efficiency and government operations policy. So that was where government said that they would procure better performing buildings. That policy is about a decade old, a little over, and it's been very impactful. How I look at that into the future, it's actually time to let rip and go harder on government procurement so that we can actually use that government leadership that both ministers have referenced and actually really translate that into action on every building. Another one that many people aren't aware of is COAG has agreed to go net zero energy on every building by 2030 and translate that through the code. So the National Construction Code change that Carlos referenced, the first 35% in commercial buildings, is the first step. And that's why we're also focused on the residential change for 2022, because residential is due to take an enormous step change. And so we're all really leaning in, because if you're going to change every building, as Frankie says, it's not just about the leaders, it's actually those regulatory pathways that take the whole economy. And that's why the Property Council and Green Building Council partnered with Minister Taylor to launch Every Building Counts federally, which is like, we think that's really important for the future, because it's our roadmap to take the country with buildings to net zero over the next decade. And what it seeks to do is unpack the policy challenges in 7 key areas and give detailed solutions at a federal, state and local level. There's 3 different policy packs, and actually seek to unpack what needs to happen in each of those sectors. And we're using our partnership to lean in to try to make that advocacy, make those changes happen, whether it's, residential building disclosure as referenced, government leadership, or frankly, having a net zero plan across the entire economy is where we start with that.
Yeah, I was very interested by the Every Building Counts policy there, that it did call for not only a zero carbon policy, but for more enforcement and more actual kind of compliance. Meaning, is that part of the problem, that sometimes there's not enough of enforcement of these rules?
Look, when we talk a lot about Green Star being the tool that we use at the Green Building Council, and some people say, oh, I'll do an equivalent version but not go the whole way. I say, if you went to university and went to a course and you didn't have an exam at the end, how seriously would you take that thing? And unfortunately, in the buildings area, unless there's regulation, unless there's an exam at the end, we know in all different settings that when there's an exam at the end, when there's compliance methodologies, when there's checking, validation and review, people actually go to a far higher standard. Now, this is far broader than just sustainability. Many of my colleagues can talk at length about what that means in flammable cladding, what that means in waterproofing, and to be frank, what that means in structural defects. But what we really need to be doing is going from policy to implementation to check and validation. And that really needs to be the holy trinity whenever we're talking in the policy context, because I remember from school, if you weren't testing me, maybe I wasn't the whole way there.
We will be testing everybody who's watching this at the end, just to make sure you're really focusing. Actually, I've got something to see how closely you're watching as well, actually. See if anyone notices. We're going to go next to Sabine Schaffer from Pro-Invest. Sabine, what do you think are the big policy drivers and the ones we need?
Well, I think, my colleagues already mentioned before, if something is not being measured, you can't manage it. And obviously, from our perspective, so we are very much active in the hospitality industry, as well as other areas in Australia and New Zealand. We believe that now that you saw, all the success that the commercial building program was able to achieve in the last 10 years for the commercial buildings, we believe that going forward, something similar should also be applicable for other areas, such as for the hotel industry. I think it's quite sad, actually, for me at least, quite sad to hear that, while Carlos was able to point out to a significant amount of additional participants in the NABERS program on the commercial building side over the last 10 years, and the resulting 30% efficiency savings. When you look at hotels, actually the numbers of parties who are NABERS rated went backwards. And I believe that one of the reasons for that is the fact that there's a lack of incentive for hotels owners to understand why they should be participating. I think that this is clearly something that's changing. But I do believe the policies are changing, from two sides. One from the customer side. So in other words, people who are starting to stay at hotels also start to ask the question, well, how environmentally friendly or not is actually the place that I stay at? But also from a policy perspective, if the government was to implement similar rules as we saw on the commercial side, whereby if you want to do business with government entities, if you want to offer accommodation to anybody who's working with the government, you need to fulfill at least you need to be NABERS rated to start with, and also maybe you need to fulfill a certain level of NABERS rating over time. I think that's going to be the only way of how we can make sure that in the long term we'll see a similar migration as we were able to see on the commercial building side as well within the hospitality space.
Thank you, Sabine. Speaking of hotels, by the way, I'll tell you one of my favourite games. Whenever I go to a hotel that has an empty fridge running constantly, I work out the carbon footprint based on the number of rooms in the hotel of the fridges running in that place. So it's a fun game. Get involved, guys. I'm going to go finally to Alicia Maynard.
It is. And
I'm going to go finally to Alicia Maynard. So, what do you think have been the most important policies in going forward?
Well, I have to agree with the panellists. The Commercial Building Disclosure Act has been instrumental in providing transparency of cost and environmental impact. It's given our tenants an opportunity to vote with their feet and to choose a space that aligns with their sustainability aspirations. And I think using that as a model, mandatory disclosure is a must for all sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about going forward? Do you think can we push more of that?
Oh, absolutely. The commercial office market, as Carlos said, has really led in this space. But there are so many other sectors that have far greater environmental impact, and it's just going under the radar. So I think if people were able to understand what the impact was, as we've said, if you're not managing it, if you're not measuring it, you're not managing. So there's far greater opportunity to go forward from where we are today, whether it's retail or industrial.
It's so true. I must admit, when I was working, doing a lot of stuff on waste, I was obsessed by whether something was mandatory or voluntary. The difference it makes is so huge. I want to continue to go into the role of standards and disclosure. I'll go to you first on this, Carlos. Can you talk about the role of standards, disclosure and leadership programs for new and existing buildings, and how do NABERS and Green Star work together? And I'll also be asking Davina about this, so you can't lie.
I was going to say about this. We do so much work with the Green Building Council that I think we should do this one together, Davina. Do back and forth. I think just to kick that off, I think we do a lot of work with the Green Building Council, and we've done a lot of work with collaboration with a lot of organizations. I think the BBP and the Property Council are just really good examples of that collaboration among lots of different parties to do more things together. But about Green Star in particular, we have a lot of people here who are regular NABERS users, but also a lot of people who are new to NABERS and Green Star. And what a lot of people think when they're new to our space is that they don't quite understand the difference between NABERS and Green Star. And a couple of things about that. The first one is that we learned a long time ago that the amount of change we need to drive in the next decade is just too big for any one of us. For NABERS or Green Star, even combined, is an enormous challenge. So we learned to work together, and we're becoming more and more complementary over time. And I think the proof of that is that if you look at sectors like shopping centers and offices, all the leaders use both because we do different things. NABERS focuses a lot on measuring your environmental footprint and improving on an annual basis on areas like energy, water, waste, indoor environment quality. And Green Star actually does a lot of things that we actually can't measure with a meter. They go into supply chain and ecology and corporate policies and modern slavery. And so the combination of NABERS and Green Star is actually really powerful. And many of the owners, if you look at many of the largest property owners in sectors like offices who have been really leading, you will see that they use them for different reasons, and both of them are really powerful. Davina, what do you think?
Well, look, I totally agree with you. For those who are new to our space, Green Star is a complex across multiple sustainability issues, and we reference and use NABERS within the Green Star suite because we're complementary, we're family. People often joke, do we argue behind closed doors? You see here, even in the lean times, we lean in, you know, we absolutely work together. So the tools themselves are complementary. I think it's really important that we fundamentally want the same thing. But I think it's really important to also understand that NABERS and the Green Building Council really work together, and we have different roles. So as an industry, you know, charity, not for profit, we have a role to advocate and lean in. You know, we're the participant who can go out there and fight for every building counts, fight for change. Whilst, you know, NABERS, the department, is the group who actually run, as a government entity, the mandatory program with the partners at CBD. So we definitively have different roles. So for example, Frankie mentioned the issues in housing. At the moment, we're looking at a leading net zero housing initiative and are going out knocking on the doors of the key housing partners and saying, we'd love to launch a net zero standard with you. We'll absolutely work to celebrate you as you bring in the next transition. That kind of lean in and celebrate the tambourine role is one that an industry association with a charity focus and a social purpose, it's a lot easier for us to do that than government. So the things that I'd really emphasise is not only do the tools work together, but as organisations we work together in a complementary sense. Because if you look at the scale of change we're trying to bring, nobody can do this individually. It absolutely must be done together.
Absolutely. Cooperation is essential given the scale of the challenge we face right now, isn't it? Thanks so much, Davina and Carlos. I'm going to move on to ask a question about, and I'll go to you first on this, Sabine. As Australia fights to recover from COVID-19, what have we learnt from it, and how can we build back a better, greener, more sustainable and more resilient Australia?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. I think that clearly with COVID-19 hitting not just Australia, but also the rest of the world, there's obviously a lot of kind of negativity and a lot of doom and gloom, in particular when you're sitting from looking at this from the hospitality lens. Having said that, we try to, I guess, embrace, what we were confronted with early on. And I think managed as well to, to try to react as quickly as possible to these upcoming new challenges that we're facing because of COVID-19. So that basically led us to, for example, look at all of the design of our existing buildings, as well as obviously the ones that are currently under construction. Think about, what is really the journey of the customer throughout the hotels. Where can we improve from a safety perspective, from a hygienic perspective? Things like, for example, breakfast buffets may be of the past, at least for the time being. So is it still necessary to build those things into the design, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a lot of work that has been done by all of our teams in the background in order to make sure that the assets that we, by the way, in the meantime started to open up again, are actually kind of very positively, I guess, embraced by the various customers. And we're actually getting, because we were always getting obviously customer feedback, and we're getting some very good responses from their side as well, taking the COVID-19, I guess, challenge, embrace it and quote unquote try to make the best out of it. Also what we see from it, which is very interesting for us, is that I guess unfortunately with empty streets, kind of no more or not as many flights, etc., I think people become more and more aware that effectively there is an alternative, hopefully, to the to achieve a carbon neutral outcome and so that everybody's participating into achieving that going forward. And that is something that we believe is an opportunity, as that given the COVID-19 situation, more and more people are aware of upcoming issues with regards to environmental disasters, for example, et cetera, that those being very often caused by climate change, and obviously climate change mostly being impacted by what we're doing on a day-to-day basis within the various areas of the economy, and how we can try to again come to an outcome where we can achieve a kind of zero carbon footprint over the next kind of we have a 2030 plan in place, but over the next couple of years to come. So I think that the two biggest things for us is, one, from a hotel's perspective, we are effectively preparing our hotels slightly different to a pre-COVID-19 situation. And I think feedback we received so far from customers was positive. And also two, that, going forward, we think that people are now more sensitive when it comes to things around, climate change, ESG, and what we can all do in order to improve our buildings at the end of the day in order to, have less of a carbon. And that is also something that we see from a number of our institutional investors, by the way, as well. So it's interesting to see how much of an ESG focus, people started to talk about already over the last couple of years, arguably, but in particular the last 12 months.
Thank you, Sabine. I'll go to you next on this, Frankie. Do you think we can build back greener, more sustainable and more resilient after COVID-19?
Yeah, we absolutely can. And I want to step back and sort of acknowledge that before COVID hit us, we had an unprecedented natural disaster hit us in the 1920 bushfire season, which a lot of communities are still recovering from. We still have people living in tents. So, we have environmental challenges ahead of us, and we've also got some really structural economic challenges for us in Australia. Our economy has largely been driven by population growth in the last couple of decades, and without that coming, we need to think seriously about a productivity agenda for the economy. And energy efficiency is a jobs machine. So we think about the challenges that are facing us. An increasingly extreme climate and the need to respond to that and make sure that people can be comfortable and safe in their homes and the places that they live, work and play, as well as needing to create jobs. A pathway focused on energy efficiency and stimulus that picks up on that is going to address both of those things. So one, the learnings out of the bushfire we need to think about, rather than just replacing, those lost homes and infrastructure with like-for-like replacements. How do we build that back, knowing that, the climate that these buildings were constructed for 40, 50 years ago is not the climate we're going to be facing in the next 30, 40 years. We can employ the skills that we have in the sector to make sure that what we're building back, are more climate resilient. A lot of people are spending a lot more time at home at the moment, and I don't know about you, but I live in a 1920s California bungalow that's absolutely freezing, and I'm thinking right now about how I'm going to insulate everything and keep myself warm, but I wouldn't be the only person thinking about that right now. So, having that, I guess, seizing the moment on people's awareness of their comfort and the way that they live at home, I don't think has ever been higher. And we need jobs, we need people in meaningful employment, and those things go together. So I just, on the one hand, it's great to see governments wanting to support the industry through things like Home Builder, but there's a real missed opportunity here in having, some of those outcomes tied to energy efficiency and climate resilience and better accessibility, because the jobs multiplier is bigger than almost anything else you can see. The one figure, and I'll stop here, but an IEA's report on a sustainable recovery said that building retrofits and building to higher standards produces 15 jobs per $1 million invested. It was higher than any other form of stimulus. So the question is not if we can do it. The question is why aren't we doing it already?
That's a very good question. If I could throw it back to you, Frankie, on that. I think part of my fear is that there's going to be, in the recovery, obviously, there's a great argument to say we can have a green, sustainable jobs-led recovery. But I fear that we're going to have the kind of, the taco approach. Why not have both? Any job is fine, no matter what happens. How do we convince people that there is a distinction between the two paths?
In terms of,
In terms of, sustainable jobs and sustainable recovery, rather than just, hypothetically speaking, a gas-led recovery.
Yeah, sure. So I guess we know that we need to be reducing our emissions to net zero by 2050. So when you look at the kinds of jobs that I guess have been engendered through, our traditional, whether that's energy supply and fossil fuels and things like that, there are actually far less jobs in that space overall for the economy. So if we're taking, a purely economic lens over this, just with a jobs focus, we know that energy efficiency jobs are actually about tradies. So, you know, it's about local employment within communities that almost always spend the money that they earn immediately out in the community. If you're contrasting, I guess, the different pathways, if you're going to try and encourage jobs in, you know, in energy efficiency and you know, and suitable retrofits and things like that, you also need to look at the other dividends. So it's not just, you know, that they're going to go spend their money locally rather than, you know, having a smaller dispersed workforce that's not going to kind of lead to the outcomes that we want. There are multiple benefits that flow from energy efficiency. It's about health outcomes. We know that climate change is a multifaceted, you know, problem that we have to deal with, and we're already seeing, you know, really scary statistics in Australia. Like more, I think we talk about this a lot when we talk about policy. To try and give a more human aspect to it and make sure that the impacts are, you know, are there front and centre. But more people die from moderate cold in buildings in Australia than they do in Sweden. That should be that's a national shame on us, right? So it's not just an economic challenge, it's a health challenge, and it's about setting up our economy for the next 30 or 40 years. We will put ourselves at a disadvantage on the international scale if we're not using, you know, the skills and expertise. We have some of the best and brightest in the world in this space, and we can be exporters of that, you know, of that expertise.
Thank you, Frankie. Speaking of that expertise, I want to move on and talk about the role of collaboration between community, industry and government. I'll come to you first on this, Alicia. How does Better Buildings Partnership encourage collaboration between commercial building owners and occupants to achieve sustainability outcomes?
An interesting mix.
Yes.
So the Better Building Partnership is in its 10th year, and it's made up of 59% of commercial office space in the Sydney CBD. It's made up of building owners, industry stakeholders and local government, all working together on a common goal to improve and accelerate the sustainability performance across the City of Sydney and transfer those learnings Australia-wide and hopefully internationally, as we've heard from the panel. Since 2006, the 98 member buildings within the partnership have reduced emissions on average by 55% and potable water demand by 26%. The success has largely been about the open collaboration that exists across an industry that's usually quite competitive. We've shared information, data, learnings and resources. We've also collaborated with industry groups, including NABERS, to create new tools and guidelines, including the operational waste guideline that will be covered in Stream 4 later on today. The guidelines includes information on best practice, on data management practices, on waste management practices. And the best thing about this is that it's freely available on our website for anyone to pick up and implement across their portfolio. We recognise that to go far, we must go together. And in 2006, the Better Building Partnership launched the Better Building Cup, which is a tenant engagement program based on social behavioural change principles that are fun and educational. So the Cup starts a conversation between the building manager, the building owner and the tenant on ways that they can work together to reduce the environmental impact of the building. We also support the uptake of the NABERS Co-Assess tool. And at times when we know where money is tight, the NABERS Co-Assess tool is the most cost-effective way for a tenant and a base building owner to rate their premises and to have a shared commitment and a shared target on how they're going to improve the sustainability performance.
That's great. Okay, I'll come to you now, Sabine, on this question. The role of collaboration, how do you see that operating in your area?
Well, thanks. I think from our perspective and experience, we were fortunate enough to, as public knowledge, to cooperate together with CEFC, for example, that's Clean Energy and Finance Corporation, on one of our assets in Melbourne South Bank. And I think there it was really a journey from the beginning. So what happened was we were able to, I guess, convince CEFC to support us even on the financing of our on the debt financing side of our assets. And it was a journey from the beginning, as basically we all sat on the same table and discussed from early on what do we need to do, which kind of design elements do we need to undertake and implement in order to achieve a minimum 5-star rated kind of hotel product at the end of the day. And it took time, and I think to what my esteemed colleague said before, you know, it was all about local kind of tradesmen, you know, being able to as well embrace new technologies, a couple of ideas that obviously DPIE came along with, and also introduced the two parties. But the outcome is that today we are effectively very proud of having the Holiday Inn Express in South Bank, you know, being, you know, clearly designed to fulfill the 5-star NABERS rating. And also importantly, all the learnings and lessons that we learned through effectively this one project, we were also able to implement throughout all of our hotel portfolio, which also resulted in, for example, our Holiday Inn Express Flores in Newcastle, which has recently as well achieved a 5-star NABERS outcome. So from our perspective, I think collaboration is key. In particular, as for a single member in the community, for ourselves, for example, it's kind of hard to always know exactly, you know, what's going on the forefront on, let's say, newest technologies when it comes to environmental sustainability. But certainly with collaborations such as the ones we have with CFC in place, you know, I think we are fairly well positioned to try to improve the, as I said, the standard, not just for one, but throughout all of our hotel estates.
Craig, if you don't mind, if I just add one thing. I think when I came to Australia 11 years ago, I think that example from Sabine is great. I remember how a lot of people didn't know how to get to 5 stars in the office sector and how difficult it was. And also that a big portion of the market thought that that was impossible for a lot of buildings. And fast forward 10 years later, and we have more than 35%, I believe, of the total office market at 5 stars already. No one designs building below 5 stars anymore. But what we don't remember is that the buildings that were designed to 5 stars in 2010 were actually learning, how do we do this? How do we actually get to 5 stars? And what Sabine's team has been working on is exactly that for the hotel sector. You know, how do we design the most energy efficient hotels and still maintain the quality that people going to these hotels need? And I think that's a really good example of collaboration and what we need a little more in the next decade. And I think the example that Alicia mentioned, I'm going to throw a lot of stats later on today, but not this one, so I thought I'll do it now. We actually saw a huge amount of increase in tenancy ratings of 60% in the last year. A big reason for that is the partnership we have with the BBP and the fact that they were looking at engaging with a lot of tenants, and we went from 200 tenancies a year to 360 or 70, something like that, give or take. And the reason why I mentioned that is because the challenge in tenancies is that there's thousands and thousands of small and medium organizations. It's incredibly difficult to reach them, but there's actually way less owners. So if we can work with owners, we can reach this additional market with a lot of people only by collaborating. I think it's another great example of that.
Thanks so much, Carlos. We're going to go to the Q&A session. Remember that you can put in questions for our panel. Hit the chat box on the screen you're watching. And already we've got some coming through. I'm going to go through them in no particular order whatsoever as well. If you feel particularly, if our panel feels particularly passionate about one of the questions, make sure you jump in. Otherwise, I'll just pick one of you, force you to answer it against your will. Here's one, actually. Davina, I might go to you first for this one. Politically, have we moved beyond the pink bats? And can the federal government support the insulation of many homes throughout Australia to make them more comfortable and more energy efficient?
Look, I think that's a really great question because politically the pink bats have been really challenging. So, for example, when our partner in New Zealand launched their home standard, they launched that with the banks and they had both. They would have Green Star or their Home Star rated homes or insulation upgrades. In Australia, there's absolutely work to do. And so we've been partnering with other cohorts, the Energy Efficiency Council, who aren't in the room today, who are doing an extraordinary piece of work on insulation to really close the guidance gap and the policy gap. Because the thing that we need when people do insulation works is there needs to be a certified program. If you put a solar panel on your roof and you get a rebate, you get a certificate where you have a qualified installer and they've signed a form and you can pass it through the process. We need to ensure that there's the same thing in the insulation space so we can open it up for green mortgages, other incentive programs, and actually have governments and the finance industry to have confidence to really back in a really critical part of the building fabric, which is the absolute reason why so many of us are suffering in our homes over this COVID winter.
Yeah, I think Frankie's already talked about that in Frankie's house first. Is that how it goes?
Frankie's first.
I would totally support a program along these lines. Can I just add to what Davina said there? Home insulation is not a bad idea. We need we need to take the learnings from that program, just like we need to take the learnings from other, policies that haven't been implemented as best they can. Back in 2011, when that was rolled out, that was the government trying to pick a winner. What could we roll out quickly that's going to give us more bang for buck? So we know that insulation is an important part of the story. What's really hampered us from having, a program that could incentivize just looking at the whole of someone's house. So insulation is one thing you would do. Draft proofing, adding, heavy curtains, glazing upgrades, ceiling fans, all these things are important. But if we don't have that foundational policy in place, like a way of you simply and easily assessing the performance of your home, you're going to be picking winners. So that's why we advocate so strongly for having a scheme that's focused on the performance of homes, because yes, insulation is important and we need to move on from that. There have been great steps around licensing of trades, and so there's a lot more integrity around those things. And I really wish we weren't having that discussion in 2020, about whether this is a good idea anymore, because it absolutely is, and we need to move forward.
Yes, absolutely. It's what we call a no-brainer. Nick asks, rather than focus on just the finished product, should we not also focus on the construction phase of buildings and the huge waste this currently produces? Anybody want to jump in front of that one?
Yeah.
Yes, Alicia?
I'll have a go at that one. I think it actually starts before construction. I think it comes to a conversation actually with investors on where they're putting their money and designing for the long term, not just for a quick return on investment. If you're designing for the long term and they're protecting their fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders, you're naturally going to be looking at better design, energy efficiency, comfortable buildings. There's a great design mandate. I think it's the definition of good architecture: long life, low energy, loose fit. And it has to be considered across, as I said, the whole of the building life cycle, including the legacy that you're leaving when the building comes to the end of its usable life.
Carlos, could you also address that? Because I know NABERS focuses a lot on buildings that have already been built. To what extent do you consider the footprint of, that building process there, or you're looking at once it's actually been created?
Yes, I think this is the kind of issue. It's a really good question, and thank you to the person who threw it at the panel. I think is an example of how to be where we need to be in 10 years or by 2050, we actually have to hit at all the problems at once. And I think NABERS has done a lot of work in existing buildings, and the challenge there, by the way, is still immense. So we need to do work for the next couple of decades, very focused on that. We as a program, and also Green Star, do a lot of work on, new buildings to make sure that they are very efficient when they come in. But there's also a huge piece around embodied carbon and how do we create demand for cleaner and lower carbon steel and cement. And that area requires a lot of incentives of all kinds, and a lot of us putting our minds to it a lot more, and a lot of people doing great work on that, including the Green Building Council. But it also requires a lot of R&D. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that we need a lot more work in that space, basically equivalent of all the work we've done on existing buildings and new buildings. And that really is the next area where we need much more volume of work in the next decade. Davina, I wonder if you want to...
I'll just step in here. This is a great example of how NABERS and Green Star work together. So NABERS has been really leading the drive on a lot of this operational waste work, which we incorporate in Green Star. But actually, Green Star for buildings absolutely focuses on development waste. We require buildings to have historically over 80% diversion from landfill, the new tools 90%. It's an enormous focus. And this is what Carlos was talking about before, the complementary nature of the tools. We're really pleased to be working with the federal government, unpacking some of, working with Clean Energy Finance Corp, unpacking life cycle analysis and embodied carbon like was discussed. We're doing material flows work with the federal government to look where national government policy should be for recommendations to COAG. So this is, like the title of this session, this is where it takes a village for those items.
Yeah, and just maybe mention one thing on waste, I forgot to mention there. I think I want to use an example from a couple of property companies that often talk about this. We think that we recycle about 50% of materials in Australia, but actually as soon as companies have done a lot of work on their recycling and follow those materials through, they realize that it's actually much, much lower than that, much lower than the aggregated statistics that we talk about. And the average building when we did our benchmarking on waste in operational waste is only recycling about a quarter of their waste and 3/4 go to landfill. So just keep that number in mind. The challenge on waste, we're nowhere near solving it. We need a ton of work, and NABERS really entered this space in force about 2 years ago. And we know that we have a huge challenge ahead working with tens of thousands of buildings. So we need as many people in this space. It's not the kind of thing that we can do alone. We need NABERS, we need Greenside, and we need many, many more people to really build all the infrastructure we need in the next decade to make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I can say from having done that task myself of trying to follow waste and see if it's recycled, it's a nightmare. And this is why it does require buildings and companies to get it down to that kind of granular level and follow it to actually make a difference. To actually say, well, there's no solution yet. We've got to find that. Actually, on this R&D and kind of solutions question, one of the questions that came in is from GS. What does the panel think about the current skill level in Australia in building services sector to further improve energy efficiency without compromising comfort? Any thoughts on further education, training and mentoring, I guess, the skills that we've got here? Sabine, would you like to address that briefly? Hello? Oh, can we come to the... having trouble getting to Sabine there? Oh, hang on.
4 cameras here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Sabine.
Hello?
Now, we might come back...
Okay, fantastic.
Oh, yeah, yes, go.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Sorry, can you just repeat the question because I had 2 people talk at the same time?
Apologies. It's just about the skill level. Do we have the skill level in buildings to kind of deal with the problems we're facing? Or how do we get more training? As you're dealing with in the hotel sector, do people have the skills and the knowledge to actually find the solutions?
Yeah, I think from the experience that we saw the last couple of years, I think the skill level of people is a fact. You can find the skill level, and if you cannot, as I just tried to allude to before, if you do not have the answers readily available, at least you know which parties you can go to asking some questions. So I think that is the one of the insights that we had, and as we mentioned before, because we sit down on the table, at the very beginning of any project from the design phase onwards. I think we certainly can kind of include a lot of kind of technologies there. I think also what is certainly very helpful is conferences such as the one that, obviously at the moment we are attending, as well as other, industry leaders, be it, people such as GRESP, such as UNREF, INREF. There's a lot of associations out there who in themselves have a wealth of data available that also helps obviously sometimes in answering questions and kind of giving necessary guidance. So I think the answer to my mind, from our learning curve has been, I think the skill set is certainly there. I think that if we don't have all the answers readily available, people, there are industry experts within a certain network that are happy to give a helping hand when required. And but it remains a learning curve. I mean, if I think of the construction companies, for example, that we are engaging, obviously when we started, our cooperation with DFC, for example, and we're asking about kind of, the compliances to certain kind of environmental standards, whatever, transportation to and from the construction site and all the rest of it. For some of them it was a first. But having said that, they embraced it and they were able to come to the required outcome. So I think overall, certainly the skill set is there, and it just takes the initiative, the drive in order to make things work. I also just wanted to touch on the fact that I do believe.
Apologies, Sabine. We're going to have to wrap it up here because we're running out of time. But thank you so much. And it is so true that that's a journey we're on. We've got to learn from the mistakes and find it further. Can I thank, please, all of the panellists that have joined us and shared their stories today. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Questions that weren't answered will actually be addressed after the event, so you'll get an answer there. So if you're, if you've got some of your kids' homeschooling questions there, you can put them in as well, and the people from NABERS will be forced to answer those as well. Certainly strong messages coming through there of collaboration. I couldn't get these guys to fight in any way or shape or form. And also the importance of those mandatory policies and what the change they push. We're now going to have a little tea break, so get yourself a cup of tea or coffee. We can't provide it for you. You're going to have to make it yourself. We're building your skills. So have a stretch and we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes at about 10:20. So we'll see you soon for the next session. Cheers.